Welcome back to the Dionysus Circle podcast. This episode is with philosopher Jakub Jirsa, whose new book is The Function Argument in Aristotle's Ethics, Happiness, and the Human Good. So, in this episode, we talk about the so called function argument in both Plato and Aristotle. The basic idea of the argument is something like this: that when we want to know whether something is good, we often ask what kind of thing it is and what its characteristic work or activity is. So, for example, a good knife cuts well, a good eye sees well, a good flute player plays the flute well. And then Aristotle basically applies this pattern to human beings. If there is a characteristic human activity, or ergon, then the human good should consist in performing that activity well. And so basically, that leads him to connect happiness with the excellent exercise of human capacities which are distinctive to us. And so Jirsa's book follows this argument from Plato's Republic through Aristotle's Protrepticus, his Eudemian ethics, and of course the Nicomachean ethics. And, in this conversation, we discuss what ergon means, how it relates to virtue, whether human beings really have a function, and other topics like that. So I began the conversation by asking Jakub what he takes to be the heart of Aristotle's ethics. I hope you enjoy the conversation.
Well, philosophers love these general questions, truly. But wait, okay. I guess that many people would say that it's virtue, because concerning Aristotle, we usually speak about virtue ethics. Some people would say that it's a human flourishing, happiness, some kind of a full development of human nature, perhaps. And some philosophers or some interpreters might go for the maxim becoming like God, becoming as similar to divine as possible. However, I try to understand this core always as a core problem which Aristotle addresses. And that, for me, would be the relation between the theoretical and the practical aspect of our nature, of what it means to be a human being. Basically, the relation between the practical side of our lives and the theoretical capacity of reason, which we have as well.
In your work, you're really sensitive to that the human being has different parts. There's different dimensions to us. And so it seems like certain parts of us sort of pull in a practical direction. And then certain other parts of the human being, of the nature of the human being, kind of pull more toward a purely theoretical activity.
Yes, you are right, Sam. So I guess the core problem, perhaps, or how to put it, uh, if I put it simply, it would be much easier not to have the theoretical reason in a certain way. That would definitely be much easier situation for us to be in. But yeah, but we see we are not, and we have to figure out what then is the role of the of the theoretical reason in our everyday actions. How they, how those two aspects come together, and it's a part of ongoing ancient debate. Um, Aristotle's Protrepticus, about which we are going to talk later as well, I guess, is exactly written as a defense of theoretical philosophy, to counter arguments or to go against arguments which call theoretical philosophy, perhaps metaphysics and so on, a completely useless endeavor, a nice practice when you are young, but an adult human being should give it up and go and devote himself to more practical issues. And I think that this is actually nicely depicted in the lines of the so called ergon argument in the Nicomachean Ethics, where basically, when Aristotle wants to say what is the ergon of a human being, he says, well, now we are left with a living of doing, practique, with a kind of a practical living, based on the rational part of us. And that means, according to him, the part that's responsive to reason as well the part that possesses reason. That doesn't matter for a while. But this specification of human ergon entails this core problem, which basically has to be investigated further. What does it mean to live a practical life based on the reason?
Okay, so this core problem of how to understand the relation between practical life and theoretical reason, you think that core problem is like importantly related to what people call the ergon argument, and which is, is the name, is the kind of the focus of the book that you just wrote and that we're kind of talking about today. So basically,
Yes.
in both Plato and Aristotle, we have something that one might want to call the function argument or the ergon argument. In Plato, it appears in Book 1 of the Republic. In Aristotle, appears in a few different places. Most famously, I guess, the Nicomachean Ethics, but Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics. But it also appears in the Protrepticus and Eudemian Ethics. So anyway, we have this idea of this ergon argument, and so you think it's importantly related to this core problem. I mean, I guess is it a way? Is basically the ergon argument? And then we'll describe what it is in a second. But is it kind of a way to find out, is the human good found mainly in a sort of practical activity, or maybe instead in a theoretical activity, or maybe some kind of blend of the two, or
Good points. Several good points, and definitely a good problem to discuss. I don't think that the ergon argument per se gives a solution to these questions you raised. As you said, it is found in several writings, both in Plato and in Aristotle. Um, Perhaps I focus more on the three occurrences in Aristotle, in the Protrepticus, the Eudemian, and the Nicomachean Ethics. And indeed, in each three of them, I do believe that it plays a specific role, or basically it plays a certain role in the overall argumentation of the text, but it can be used to produce different conclusions, so to say, exactly different conclusions about this particular way how to relate the practical and theoretical in Aristotle's work. So famously, Eudemian and Nicomachean Ethics differs in that subject. We might come to it later. And then Protrepticus has yet another way how to approach these things. But yes, you are right. In all of those writings, the ergon argument, the so-called ergon argument or function argument appears.
good. Okay, and maybe we could just, before kind of like analyzing each argument, and also kind of describing what you see as the sort of overarching commonality between all of them. Basically, one of the key ideas in your book is that, like, the ergon argument for Aristotle is really the way he moves from a more like formal discussion of various ethical concepts to something much more substantial in his ethical theory. And yeah, so before we get kind of into all that, I was thinking maybe we could try to give a little bit of a sense for the listeners,
I agree.
What exactly the ergon argument might, like, how it works or how it plays out. So like, I was just thinking, like, just really quick, like in Book 1 of the Republic, basically you have a situation where Socrates, he's arguing with Thrasymachus about whether justice or injustice is the better way of life. And basically, Socrates is like, this is like a really important issue. It's really about the way one should live. And he then introduces the idea of an ergon, or a work, or a function. And he kind of says this idea that, like, well, the ergon of a thing, the work or the function of a thing, it's what that thing can only do, or what it does better than other things. So for example, only eyes can see.
Yeah.
Or a pruning knife, that's a case where, they can prune vines better than anything else.
Yeah.
Anyway, and then basically what Socrates then does is he applies it to the soul, and he's like, maybe the soul has its own work, its own job to do, living, ruling, managing. And then he also, and then virtue comes up, where it's like, virtue is what lets the thing do its work well.
Let's start to make it simple for our listeners, right? And let's start by a negative example, right? You yourself, you mentioned knife. Well, but we all know that if in a situation when, for example, I need a crowbar, just to like open something with it, and I miss it, I don't have it with me, a knife can serve as a crowbar. Well, and if I'm in a situation that I miss a screwdriver, right, to screw something in or out, well, I mean, perhaps everybody uses sometimes a knife in a situation like this instead of a screwdriver, for example. But the point is that a crowbar is always better in levering something open, and the screwdriver is always better with screws than a knife. Yet, when it comes to cutting, a knife is the instrument you want. Like, there might be some other instruments you could use, but knife is basically best in it. A knife is there for cutting, and cutting is the ergon of a knife. It tells you what a knife is. It is important that this activity or product or ergon is always telling us something substantial or essential about the entity
Mm.
of which it is an ergon. And it is analogous with the eye, right? I mean, there is no other organ we can use for seeing, or, well, yes, if it's really dark, sometimes you orient yourselves around in space with the help of your
Yeah.
of your hands and touch and so forth, so on. But basically, the eyes are best for that. Seeing is the ergon of an eye. So and then when it comes to natural entities, it's always actually a bit more tricky. Plato, for example, mentions the ergon of a horse, but he never says what it is, and I have to say I have no idea. Perhaps running, or I don't know. However, one could say that even in this case it would definitely be something specifically horseish, if you can say that terrible term, something belonging to a horse and telling us something about what a horse is. So basically, that is perhaps how to explain the term ergon.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. So there's some kind of characteristic work associated with at least, yeah, like a lot of things around us, like clearly, yeah, it seems like, yeah, a flute player, his thing, the activity that you want to connect with him is playing the flute. Knife, the activity you want to connect to a knife is cutting. Eye, the activity is seeing, and that's really interesting. The point you make about, and it seems like at least in those cases, in those examples, um, that activity is like related to the nature or the essence of the thing. Um,
Yes, but let's make
yeah.
it even more complicated, because in all the examples which we had so far, eye, seeing, pruning knife, pruning vines, and so forth, so on, or an ergon of a cloak, which would be to cover and protect us, and so forth, so on. Uh, it might seem that really it is function or activity or something like that. But uh, there comes the problem, because sometimes this translation of ergon as function can be slightly misleading, since
Mm.
ergon can be, for example, a thing or a product. A shoe is an ergon of shoemaking. The shoemaker makes shoes. It's basically not only the activity which we want from him; it is the product which there is. So basically, that has to be taken into the consideration as well. That it's kind of complicated to find a term which covers exactly the semantic range um, as the Greek term ergon.
Well, that is kind of complicated because it's like maybe intuitively, it's like you want to say, well, why don't we just restrict ergon to the activity associated with some type? So it's like for the shoemaker, why don't we just say, well, the shoemaker's ergon is making the shoes because that's his characteristic activity.
Well, I mean,
Why would we also want to say it's the shoe? Could you just flesh that out a little bit? Yeah.
yes, and I don't think one needs a bit much of philosophy here. Well, if you go to a shoemaker, right? What do you want from him? You want a bloody shoe. You don't want him, showing you how he does that only, and you don't want the activity. You want the thing which you put on your feet and walk away. So that's basically the product which you want in this case.
Well, no, that makes sense. I'm just thinking like you could say the same thing with a knife, though. It's like what I want is the apple to be cut in half
Yeah.
or whatever.
And I want to walk
Um,
out in the shoes.
right.
And basically now, if we push the analogy further, the shoemaker has to produce a shoe so that we make it, and basically the knife has to open the can or open the box with the food or whatever it is in there. But the knife cuts the thing, and that is what it's supposed to do. If you say that the idea in with the cobbler is that it merely, works and it is merely the activity, you will never actually get what you want from him.
Okay. Fair enough. Yeah. I mean, at the very least, it's very clear that it seems like in certain cases, at least, whatever ergon or characteristic activity is associated with a thing, often that activity issues in a product, and that product is often like the reason why that thing exists in the first place. Like, yeah, like the
In some
cobbler.
cases,
Yeah,
yes.
it
In
seems
some
like with
cases, it's not. So, for
right.
example, in the case of an eye, the seeing is the whole is what the eye does. I mean, there is no a product over and above this kind of a seeing, as far as it is treated in these texts, right? It's the activity itself. That's it.
Okay, interesting. Good. Well, I love the point about like we have to think about the complications, because I think that's something that is so excellent about your book, which is that um, well, you know, to back up a little bit, it's like I think the listener probably has a sense for how this is relevant to ethics, where this is going. The idea is going to be like, well, if we want to figure out how to be a good human, maybe what we need to do is figure out the ergon that the human being has, the function that the human being has, because if we do that well, presumably then we would be a good human being. So anyway, people can probably kind of anticipate that, but I just wanted to flag like your book is really good at like bringing up the tricky questions. Do humans even have an ergon? Is the human ergon natural? Is it assigned? Which human activity among all the various ones is the main human activity?
Yeah.
So, and we'll get kind of into those. But for now, why don't we just turn to the idea of virtue? Because
Mhm.
we've kind of set up this idea of an ergon or a function, and as I mentioned in the original, Republic passage, the idea of virtue comes up. But yeah, could you just quickly spell out,
Yes.
what's the
Yes, I
connection
can.
between?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
I do believe I can, and it is actually kind of an easy scheme which explains my understanding of virtue, arete in Greek. So let's say, in a general abstract way, that we have an entity, and this entity does something. Its activity does something, and this activity can be done well or badly. Right? I mean, you can succeed in it, you can fail, you can do it good in a good way, you can do it in a bad way. And then the property or quality of the entity, due to which or because of which the entity does a given activity well, that is virtue. This set of these characteristics, which is responsible for, or which is responsible so that the entity does something well, is a virtue or goodness. Some people translated it a goodness of a given thing. And on the other hand, the property or the characteristics because of which a given entity does something badly might be called badness or vice. So, yes, in this sense, let's say, um, which property is important for a knife to cut well. It doesn't have to be size. It's definitely not color, right? It's sharpness. So although no nowadays it would be very strange to call sharpness of a knife a virtue, but it's perfectly fine way how to describe what the ancients meant by arete, by virtue. And yes, we speak then specifically about human virtues, about moral virtues, but still it is basically a property or a characteristics of an entity which is responsible for uh, the fact that a given entity does something well.
Okay, that's very clear. Okay, so it's like you have an entity. Generally, often these entities seem to have like characteristic activities, and then generally speaking, at least with the examples that we've been thinking about, that activity can go well or poorly. So the knife, its activity is cutting, but like some knives cut better than others, and so we want an explanation. What's separating
Yeah.
these various knives?
Or we can go directly to
Yeah.
human being and its certain virtues. So, for example, you know, friendship seems to be possibly something where some kind of a virtues can be at play. Now, I'm not talking about any specific about specific author or such, but basically, I can be doing well with getting friends and having a strong bonds and basically
Mhm.
enjoying friendship and so forth, so on. Or I can do that badly. So basically, either I'm virtuous in that sense or I'm not. Or when it comes to being witty, right? Another great virtue described by Aristotle. I can, I can do well in being witty and saying, telling good jokes at the appropriate moment and not too much and not too little or not to be grumpy and so forth, so on.
Mhm.
Or I can be a terrible joker, I can be really bad at it and I can suck in it and everybody uh, would suffer around me telling jokes. And so basically this is the activity and it can be done well or bad. And then when we are looking at the reason why, we can describe and see that this person is, for example, good at being friend or having friends and being friend and being in a relationship with friends, or that he or she is good in transactions, right? Meaning he or she is just. And when I suck in transactions, so for example, when I rip other people off and so forth, so on, I'm unjust. So that's a very easy way how to understand what a virtue does.
Okay, so on the one hand, just to emphasize, like, a lot of listeners, in just generally speaking, in our contemporary day, when you think of virtue, you normally think of like various moral virtues. But, so the first point is, hey, actually, you can talk about the virtues of a knife, you can talk about the virtues of a basketball, because it's just going to be whatever property allows the thing to do its characteristic work.
And to excel in it, right?
Yeah, to excel, exactly. Okay, and then the other thing too is that, okay, I think if we ask somebody, "Hey, is wit a virtue?" I think, a lot of people might say, "Yeah, I suppose it is." Maybe they would, even if that's not necessarily like like morally loaded. But what they might not immediately think of is like the activity that it's connected to, that it makes excellent. So I think it's really interesting how you're saying, look, like you can think about different activities, or like friendship, for example, and you can think about what are the properties that allow a human being to excel at being a friend. And so anyway, it's kind of, so I guess it's like you could discuss the virtues relevant to a particular activity, but then what about virtues just in general? Like, I guess I have the thought of, okay, if the human being had a specific activity which was like made to do, which was like everyone is supposed to do it, then maybe the virtues that let you do that activity well would just be like pure and simple, the virtues, not simply like, oh, that's a virtue for doing that specific activity of friendship, but these are the virtues that like everyone should want regardless of who you are. Anyway, do you kind of see my point here? It's
I
because it
see,
seems,
I see, I see, I see your point. So, but that to develop this point or to explain it, uh, it it would need a broader explanation, let's say, or to at least how I'm trying to make sense out of it. So, uh, yes, in what sense what you said is important when we are talking about the ergon argument and when we are talking about all these different examples. So I do believe that the thought in the background is such that Aristotle seems to believe in a certain natural scale of living entities, of living beings, right? I mean, you start with and it's something which is generally known. You start with the plants, and you got animals, you got human beings, and then possibly some kind of divine entities, gods, or something like this
Like a hierarchy.
on
Yeah.
this hierarchy of living being. And then you have those um, strange entities which are capable of somehow like dualizing between the two, right? Something very you're not sure whether it's a plant or animal and so forth, so on. And
Mm.
some human beings can behave as badly as to become nearly animals, and some animals are kind of a clever or wise and so forth, so on. And then you have some special kind of a human beings which are capable of becoming like God, as we said at the beginning. So, but it seems that he at the same time believes that this scale is somehow normative, meaning that the higher you are on this scale, somehow better it is, or at least that activity which you can do is better than the activities which are found below you. And then if there is indeed a certain kind of an activity which is characteristic of us as human beings, if there is a certain kind of an activity which is essential for what we are as a human beings, which basically makes human beings distinct, and by that it makes them what they are, and we can figure out what kind of property, what kind of characteristics of us, what kind of virtue improves or makes this activity good. That is $1 billion question. That is a great way how to figure out, how to cultivate what we are, but what kind of a virtue we can calculate this essentially important activity of us, which makes us human beings. So that I think is somehow a possible background for your question, right? That if we can figure out what this, I mean, with a knife, it's simple, right? I mean, if it's sharpness, then when we sharpen the knife, it becomes a good knife. It's definitely more complicated with human beings, but if we are capable of figuring out what kind of activity we have to uh, improve so that we excel in what we are in being in being a human being, and therefore being a good human being, that's an important question to investigate.
I mean, it seems like it could be a way of trying to get some handle on, fundamental moral or ethical questions. So, if you're trying to figure out, how should we live? Well, you know, if human beings have a distinctive activity, something that makes us what we are and maybe places us above other living things, then it seems like we should ask, what virtue or excellence lets us perform that activity well.
Right, and you
Uh,
have to know what activity it is, or to put it in Aristotle's terms, mm, living any other life than the life of a human being is perhaps possible for us somehow, but it would be always worse for us than living a life which is truly human, right? I mean, we want to live a kind of a life that suits us as human beings. And living any other kind of a life, doing any kind of other activities might be possible, but it will be but we will always be worse off. We will always suffer because living the life which is natural for us means that we are living a kind of life which corresponds to our nature, allows our nature to excel, and allows us to live a good life as well. So basically, that would be some part of what of the importance of figuring out certain kind of a general activity or a certain kind of human ergon, which helps us to start the investigation and to interpretation of, let's say, what a good human life is, what human good is in general.
Okay, so at this point, I kind of have a question for you, Jacob. That I'm curious what you think. So this might be my, I don't know, maybe this is like a platonic side of me showing here, but here's like one thing I was thinking while reading your book is like, okay, so one route you could take okay, so let's say broadly speaking, we're trying to figure out, how to live life, how to live it well. Okay, and it seems like one route you could take is be like, okay, what is the characteristic human activity? So, what is the ergon of the human being? And let's say we took that in the Republic way of defining the ergon. So, like, we could be like, what's the only thing that what's the thing that we can that only us can do? What's the activity that only we can do? What is the distinguishing activity? The thing that a plant can't do, the thing that we can only do, and a frog can't do, an ape can't do, and so forth. Or maybe we could look for the thing that we can do best. All right, so that would be one route, and it seems like that's the route that Aristotle kind of took. He looked for the characteristic activity, the ergon of the human being, and he kind of, in a way, built his ethical theory around that. But now, to be honest, I kind of had this intuition of like, well, why wouldn't you do instead something else? Why not instead go, what's the best thing we can do? So, not of all the activities, which one is like specifically ours, or of all the activities, which one um, is the one that we are best at doing, but which one is just the best thing? So, like, there, my thought is like, you start from an idea of like,
Mm.
what's good generally speaking, what's the good, and then you pick among our possible activities, you just do the best. So I guess, like, here's like my thought, and I know this connects to the stuff you talk about in your book, but it's like, if it turns out the best thing we can do is, let's say, contemplate, and then you tell me, oh, guess what? God can also contemplate. I'm not really worried about that because I'm like, yeah, well, we should just do whatever's best. I understand that it's not only us that can contemplate. Yeah, God can contemplate too, but that's fine. We should just do whatever's best. So anyway, I don't know what you think about that, Jacob. Just
Right. I,
yeah.
I, I think I have two thoughts on that. Uh, Possibly, I might be slightly careful with going from Plato's conception and definition of the what ergon is to Aristotle's usage
Right, right.
of the ergon argument. Right, there are a lot of people like Rachel Barney in her great article believes that basically Aristotle departs from Plato's conception of the ergon, which is usually
Okay.
some kind of like an instrumental usage somehow. And yes, indeed, as you said many times, Plato in the Republic defines ergon as he said, that which one can do only with it or best with it or something like this. Uh, However, in the Udemy version, we don't find this stipulation, not at all. Um, Aristotle claims in the Protrepticus that everything is done well or everything is well disposed when it is in accordance with its own proper virtue, right? So there suddenly appears something, this kind of a proper virtue, like something which is proper to us. And famously, in the Nicomachean Ethics, he says that he looks for something which is own to us. Some people say peculiar, but I like something more than our own, which is idion, which belongs to the given entity alone. Right. So it means that Aristotle seeks something that is proper to us human beings, and what distinguishes us from other living beings, especially the so-called lower life forms, and as well perhaps from uh, from the divinity. Now, and there, here it comes to something which is important and which I try to argue for in my book as well. I don't think that the fact that the best activity we are capable of, namely perhaps the theoretical thinking, the contemplation, theoria, as he said, and the fact that it might be possibly the same activity that the gods do or that the divine does, might be might be problematic for the rest for the rest of the Aristotle argumentation, because still it seems that we do it at least in a very different way than the divine does. To be clear, the divine is this activity. It's nothing else. It's this pure activity of thought with no potentiality, no rest, nothing. But it's not our case. And now, of course, then the question is how. We sometimes think, sometimes don't. We sleep, we need to take a rest, and so forth, so on. So there is some kind of a unique way how we do this, which is common to us and which differentiates us from lower forms, from lower animals, as well as from the divine, which is over and above us. And we should not forget about that, because Aristotle at many places says that basically, the human being is not the highest the living form in the universe. There is always something over and above it, and so forth, so on. So uh, that would be that one point. And saying that, well, then the next question would be, how does this affect our way of life? How does that affect our decisions and our constructions of the way how we live? But that's a different question, I believe.
That's fair enough. Especially the point about potentially that definition of ergon was using. Um, that might just be the Republic definition, maybe not exactly the Aristotelian one, and especially because when Aristotle, even though he's searching for the proper, what is own most, I guess, to the human being in terms of activity. I mean, maybe what is proper, what is own most, is actually determined by what is best, what we can do best. So I don't know if that's the case, but you
If
know,
I may, right, I forget about one thing. The assumption behind is that if you look for a good of a certain thing, you find it in its ergon, namely in its doing its ergon good. As you said at the beginning, human beings do several different. We do a lot of activities, we do a lot of things of different generality, and so forth, so on. But when we ask what makes a human being a good one, then it is Aristotle would answer the excellence in that kind of an activity or activities which are proper to being a human. So basically,
yeah,
just to make it simple and to give a simple example, when we talk about the shoemaker, so basically, how do you tell a good shoemaker from a bad one? Well, because the good one does makes good shoes, right? That's it. Its ergon
yeah,
is a good one.
right. Let maybe talk about the horse thing, right? So famously in the Republic, or I don't know if it's famous, but basically Socrates asked the question of, tell me, do you think there is such a thing as the ergon of a horse? So it seems really clear that, at least it's very plausible to me, that like, yeah, various natural implements, equipment, my espresso machine, it has an ergon. My, the cup, the phone, the knife. Okay. Once you get to living things, I'm a little bit less like, I don't, does it have an ergon? I'm not, does it have a function?
Hmm.
Um,
Right.
so anyway, yeah, can you walk us through that?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, it's I see the problem, or I think I see the problem, and I might see where you are heading. Well, um, knife and other artifacts are easy because there is an intention, there is the creator, there is someone who makes a knife to be the best thing you can use for something for, and then there is someone who makes another kind of an instrument, and it's designed, intentionally designed for doing something. Now, it's definitely much less obvious with the natural entities, right? And because the natural entities, for example, are somewhat complex, and basically it's not a simple entity, but it's always a complex organic entity, and so forth, so on. So that's what makes it complicated. So, well, okay. What we can what we could talk about, but it will be much longer, and I do believe for a different talk, that I guess that what comes forward here is the idea of natural teleology, of natural, some kind of a natural way of entailing something like a purpose in natural human beings, well, sorry, in natural living beings, and so forth, so on, or in living beings general. Well, yes, uh, that's true, but it at the same time opens two related questions. uh, the question of an organism and the question of whether an ergon of something in a complex entity can be related or dependent on something or someone, right? Um, so the clear case in the knife is the creator. You know, the man who made the knife, this particular knife, had an intention, put it in there. But at the same time, when you talk about the horse, right, in the Republic, and I have to say, I really do not know what Plato thought the ergon of a horse might be. If I remember right, he might talk about swiftness, about as its virtue, but I'm not sure he says something about what actually the ergon of a horse is. It's just agreed that everybody knows that there is something like an ergon of the horse, and they go forward, which is kind of a tricky.
Yeah.
Uh, but okay, could it be, for example, that the horse's ergon is a way how it serves human beings, right? I mean, we talk about the domesticated horse or something like this. And indeed, uh, the interesting question, can an ergon of something be essentially relative, namely related or dependent on something or someone? And this is a problem which Aristotle discusses, right? This is the problem which he is interested in. Uh, if I could quote from the Protrepticus, if I remember it right, he says that something that is composite and partitioned has many activities, but something that is by nature simple and whose substance is not relative to anything else necessarily has a single virtue in itself in a strict sense. That doesn't matter for now. But what is perhaps more interesting is that in a complex entity which has several activities, uh, it is always a bit more tricky to figure out what is the ergon of such a given such a given complex entity.
Right.
It is not so easy because there might be some entities or things where their ergon, I believe, is relative and context dependent. However, perhaps mainly in the sphere of artifacts, artificially created entities. What do I mean? Let's talk about the example of an artifact, perhaps a catapult, right? You know the things which throws the stones when you try to conquer another polis, another
Yes.
city,
Very
and
important in medieval times.
yeah,
Yes.
exactly. And I guess that there is that this piece of wood which actually moves, you call the arm of the catapult. And the virtue of the arm is its strength and the flexibility, since only a strong and flexible arm would work well, right? So basically, if that arm is strong and flexible, it works as a good arm. However, apart from the catapult as a whole, it is basically a log of wood, and strength and flexibility remain its quality. But there is no reason to call them virtues in this way. The virtue of the arm of the catapult is derived from its position within the larger whole. And in this respect, the arm is not a simple entity according to the passage from the Protrepticus, which we mentioned above. And the second issue to discuss here are, of course, a complex organic entities, living living beings as humans or something like this, and their bodily parts, right? And the important thing is that it seems that Aristotle believes that if you if these parts, natural parts, are naturally organized, and we know that uh, their activities are always considered in relation to a whole. So, for example, if I cut my finger and cut my hand, well, I mean, it somehow loses its function or its ergon as a hand or as a finger, right? That's something to it. And but
Which is
when
why
they
it's bad to cut your hand, I guess.
sorry.
Which I guess is why it's bad to cut your hand.
No,
It's like,
no, no. We can come back to that. I don't think so. I mean, I think
okay,
that here the moral badness of depriving, for example, that piece of meat, bone, and sinews of its ergon by cutting it is not that basically you go against its ergon. It's basically that you harm yourself. It's painful and you harm yourself. This is the source of the badness here. It's slightly
of the moral
it's
badness. Okay, I was thinking,
it's more complicated to get from the ergon argument into actual ethics, because in this respect, and now we are going slightly astray from what I wanted to say, but I should mention it now. In the contemporary divisions of ethics, or basically how usually the ethical theory is structured, I do think that the ergon argument would belong to something which nowadays is called the metaethics, right? And its
hmm.
relation to normative ethics is quite complicated. So basically, that's it. That's it. But uh, what I wanted to say about the complex entities, I do believe that Aristotle assumes that if a certain whole is composed of parts which have a function and which are for the sake of something, and they are composed in a natural way, then the corresponding whole is naturally for the sake of something and has a function as
Ye
well.
yes, I think this argument is fascinating. I mean, you discuss it, and it comes up in the Nicomachean Ethics, this point that Aristotle makes. Maybe I could just read it because I think this is a very interesting argument where he says, and so again, it kind of I think it relates to the question of does the human being actually have an ergon, in the first place? And he says, are there then certain functions and activities of a carpenter and a shoemaker, but none of a human being? So, point being there, like, interesting that everyone would agree that we have various social roles or professions that have functions, but then claim that the human being doesn't have one. That would be kind of odd, maybe.
Hmm.
He says, is he by nature without a function, the human being? And then he gets to the organs like you're talking about here. Or just as an eye, hand, foot, and in general, each of the parts plainly has some function, may one also posit some function of the human being beyond these? And so you kind of do a really fascinating analysis of this. And I found it because like I said, I was kind of like, I'm not so sure a human has an ergon. I'm not sure a living thing has an ergon. But I thought this was a very powerful argument, to be honest, where it's like, okay, like, so it's kind of an inductive argument. It's like, or at least one version of it is inductive, where you just say, hey, look, wouldn't it be surprising if all the parts of a human being had an ergon, but the human being as a whole didn't? That just seems kind of odd.
Well, as far as I remember, right, I'm trying to be slightly careful here in this argumentation. I do
Okay.
believe what Aristotle does here is that he plays the ball to the other side of a net, right? Let's imagine someone who says, "No, Aristotle, you are completely wrong. There is no such a thing as a human ergon," right?
Right.
And I'm really not sure whether any of the versions of the ergon arguments explicitly argues for the fact that a human being has an ergon. I do believe that it's an
Oh,
assumption
okay.
there,
Interesting.
which
Okay.
is really which is assumed, and Aristotle shows good reasons why we should think that it has an ergon here. I'm not sure he gives us an argument, proof, or anything like this. But and as far
Okay.
as I can tell, or how I would summarize it, what goes on in this way in the Nicomachean Ethic aspects. He talks about there about, let's say, occupations as social roles. Right. On the one hand, he has the flute player, the cobbler, and we can add to it, for example, the role of a father or a husband's son, and so forth, so on. And on the other hand, you got the organs, you got the eye, hand, and so forth, so on. So, first, a human being is an entity which is composed out of parts which have a function, which have an ergon, and it is living in an environment, in social environment, so to say, where yet again it has certain functions, certain erga, because it has an occupation, it has a family role. Perhaps sociology could talk about the roles here, right? So it would be very strange if that entity, which is which is natural, composed of parts which have an ergon, and so to say, living in the environment and cycle and encircled by functions, by the social functions which we have, that entity would be without a function on its own. So that and now the ball is on the other side of a net. And if you still want to argue that there is no function of a human being, you have somehow explained how come that it might be so different from anything around it that it would lack an ergon.
Yeah, I mean, I love this argument. I know you're saying you're not sure if quite if it's supposed to function as an argument for human beings having a function, but I do kind of think of it as because it's just like you consider two hypotheses. One hypothesis is that the human being has no ergon. The other hypothesis is that we do, and it seems like under the hypothesis that we do not have an ergon, it would be very surprising, hard to predict that even though we don't have an ergon, all of our parts do, and our entire social life is saturated with a bunch of so.
And remember that basically, yes, the parts have their ergon and the function in relation to the whole, right?
Well, that's
A
yeah, right.
naturally composed entity is something else than I mean, if you have the garage sales, you take a box and you put all different things into the box, and you put a box outside of your house, a garage sale, and those things together in the box. Well, I mean, there is no, so to say, an ergon of that complex entity, though you can perhaps like, or you put a different things together and you tie them with a rope or something like this. No, here we have a natural entity, and the function of the organs in the natural entity is always related to that entity as a whole. As I said, exactly. When I cut my finger, it might be a finger by name only, but it's not a finger anymore because it doesn't function as one. It functions as one only as a part of the complex entity. And then it would be very strange if that complex entity would be deprived of that kind of an ergon as well.
So to me, that almost is like, I guess, I don't know if you would agree with this, but to me, it almost seems like there are two possible arguments. Like, one is this sort of inductive type argument where it's just like, look, it would be very surprising, seemingly unlikely for the human being parts to all have ergon, to each have each part to have an ergon, and then suddenly the whole thing as a whole doesn't have one. But then I feel like to me, it's almost like a second argument, a more deductive one, where it's like, well, if you actually think about if you think about the function of each of these parts, you realize that the function actually is relative to the whole. And so there, it's almost seems like you could maybe try to generate a more deductive argument where it's like, look, if the whole had no function, then these parts which gain a function with respect to the whole themselves would never have a function. And so I almost had the thought of like it seems like we could extract on the one hand a more inductive argument and on the other hand a more deductive argument. But
As nice as it would be, I'm not sure I can dig something like that out from the text, unfortunately. So
well, that's fair. Yeah, yeah.
I still go with the basically yes. It's enough at that point to play the ball on the other side of the net, and perhaps somebody comes and explains you that you are wrong, but in a given context, it's fair enough to go on, because you can continue, and you can show how what else would be there, and what how to develop then some kind of a normative ethics further on, and so forth, so on. Um, but I'm not sure that I would be capable of digging out this argument from the text itself.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. Good. Well, maybe we can look to another kind of interesting issue that you discuss. So, I mean, we've already touched on it, but what about the whole issue of like the human being? Very plausible. It seems like we're complex, and it seems like we can do a lot of different activities. We can digest, we perceive, we desire, we think, we speak, we deliberate. We do a lot of different activities. So, and then
Why to choose the one that Aristotle chooses? If I
well,
have
yeah, I
to.
mean, I guess it's like which activity is going to count as the
Mm, mm.
ergon. Or maybe another question would be, why can't we have multiple ergon? Would that mess things up if we had a few? Um,
Right. I mean, so to the first version of it, I mean, there is a text by Bernard Williams, if I remember it right, and he says, well, I mean, even if Aristotle looks to something which is own to our human right to human beings, so for example, those are if I remember right, it's his example of making fire, right, or using fire for some kind of a technological improvement, and so forth, so on. That's something. Or I'm not sure whether he mentions telling jokes as well, or something like this. Well, I mean, as far as I can tell, Aristotle methodology somehow differs from and has a possible answer to those counter arguments, that it's unfair to pick up the activity which he picks up, the activity of our soul, or the practical living with reason, or however you want to call it. I mean, making a fire is a fine activity, but when we are talking about the good human life, and we are talking about the goal of the good human life, and the ergon argument functions there as one of the first steps on this interpretation in which we go. I mean, trying to imagine a life which is organized around making fire, and as such, nothing else, or about telling jokes, right? I mean, that's kind of strange, and well, perhaps you can go and try, but I don't think you will find it any kind of pleasant or satisfying, and so forth, so on. So I guess that this in this way, that's the point where why Aristotle is convinced that he has to go to the broadest possible activity which involves human beings, as such, because that's basically the issue of his ethics, a good human life. So basically, then he looks for an activity which is natural for humankind, and not a particular part of it. So, for example, not a flute playing or ruling or something else, because only few of us do that. And at the same time, he goes for that one which is not shared with at least the lower living beings, or the other living beings, such as the animals or plants. I'm not sure that
okay.
it is helpful. And if you said
Well,
about multiple erga, that yes, he actively tries to avoid that. There is at least in the Protrepticus and in the Nicomachean Ethics, when he talks about human happiness, and then it has some counterparts in his usage of the ergo in the wording of the ergon argument as well. He says, well, you know, eudaimonia, human happiness or flourishing, is the activity of our soul in accordance with virtue, and if there are more virtue, then the best one of them, right? And
right.
it's as I said, even when he talks about the own virtue, the oikea arete, a single virtue which is something our own and peculiar to us, then yet again, this is the term which is found only in the Protrepticus and the Nicomachean and it is somehow suspiciously absent from the Eudemian ethics, right? So,
Mm.
and in both in the and my feeling, or one of the conclusions which I try to put forward in the book is as well, and then that allows in the Nicomachean ethics and in the in and not in the Protrepticus exactly, but definitely in the Nicomachean ethics, that allows Aristotle to say what the human happiness is as a single activity, right? Namely, in the Nicomachean ethics, the contemplation.
So yeah, so we asked the question, why not identify the human ergon with something distinctively human, like using fire or making technology or telling jokes? Okay. And it's like, okay, those may be distinctive human activities, but they're too narrow because what we're really looking for is an activity that's sort of like it's like the human life as a whole, the activity of human life as a whole. And it seems like with using fire, it's like I don't know how to explain this, but I guess I'm just having this kind of sense right now that that clearly sort of fits within a broader context of like I don't know, surviving or like meeting the necessities of life or maybe like family life or home life or like securing. So in other words, it kind of seems to be fit like making fire seems to be sort of fitting within a context that isn't just the human life as a whole. In other words, it just ends up seeming too narrow to me. I don't know how to quite me.
Well, I mean, still, I when we go back to the text and we find that Aristotle wants to find something which is own to us, which is idiom to us, and
Mhm.
for example, something which the topics describe as something that belongs to a given entity alone, right? Even though it might be problematic in the case of human beings in relation with the gods, uh, it seems to me that it's something which is proper, and at the same time, it is something which Aristotle says expresses our nature, or even sometimes he talks that it somehow depicts or shows something about our essence, right?
Mhm.
So it would indeed allude to the best realization of our nature as well. And this means that Aristotle seeks something that is proper to us, human beings, that which distinguishes us from other human beings, especially so-called lower form of lives and animals, right? And that condition and comparison with other life forms introduces this hierarchy of living activities, which we talk about already, and we must
Mhm.
distinguish human beings from the lower forms, from the higher forms, right? And if there is something proper to us, human beings, then fully realizing this means realizing what we are and what is natural and proper for us. Failing to achieve this means failing to realize what we are. Moreover, then destroying, for example, the capacity which manifests itself in this activity of our ergon, namely, so for example, deliberately destroying our reason or something like this, would be a destruction of what we are. So that's somehow one way how to organize how to understand that.
Yeah, would you want to describe in rough terms for us, why think why think contemplation specifically would be the best activity? It seems to be, I mean, it makes sense that it seems to be the activity connected to the best part of us, I suppose, reason or intellect.
Yes, but there is a long road from the ergon argument to contemplation. As I said, in the Nicomachean Ethics, when we look if when we look for something which might be the conclusion of the ergon argument, then Aristotle says that it is the statement that the human good is the activity of soul exhibiting the appropriate virtue, right? Or that what the and that the ergon he's looking for is this active life in accordance or with the news. There is no talk about a contemplation at this place, and we need basically eight more books or nine more books to get to the fact that when we ask the question, what is happiness, the answer is that it's contemplation. So it's in that way it is more complicated than that, and we should still, within the framework of the argument, work
Yeah.
with those conclusions
Yeah.
which are far away from
Yeah.
the final conclusions of the text.
So, right. So in the arrogant argument, we do, in terms of more substantial, yeah, we're not reaching the point of saying that happiness is contemplation. So, for example, in the Nicomachean Ethics, yeah, like conclusion, I suppose we reach is that the ergon of the human is going to be some activity of the soul that involves reason.
Yes, and therefore we have to investigate those activities. We have to investigate what a virtue is and what are particular virtues. Uh, exactly, but there is a long way from the ergon argument to the final conclusion of the. There are some suggestions that already some terminology used in the ergon argument in the different texts is used in a way that might give us some hints what to think about the conclusion of the book. But as I said, usually the ergon argument is found in the first book of the treatise, and then we have to still wait for much longer, for a long time, till we get to the conclusion of the actual book.
Yeah, we reach the point of like knowing that if the argument succeeds, we reach the point of knowing that the kind of thing that happiness is going to be, I guess, excellent soul rational activity.
Definitely, there is a relation between the two, but the relation is really complicated. I'm trying to show in one of the chapters in the book how the conclusion in the Nicomachean Ethics can be linked with the ergon argument at the beginning of the book, but it's rather problematic and in a way technical to show how to do that, and we would have to go to as I said, to the terminology used and so forth, so on.
Okay, good. Well, just to kind of close things out, then, I mean, is there anything? Obviously, there's, we we only barely scratched the surface. But I don't know. Is there anything that you'd say like you want um, readers to take away from your book? Any main points or?
Uh, well, I mean, I do believe that someone might use the book to see how not to write about Aristotle, for example, and somebody might use the book for better understanding of Aristotle's ethics. But well, perhaps I think there is one issue which 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 might need some further attention, further work, and it would be nice if that could be a start of a further discussion in that particular subject, and that is one of the things which I open, and I know that I open them in a very unsatisfactory way, is the chronology of Aristotle's texts, right? Um, because because now we can work with the Protrepticus in a much better way than we could do ever before, because basically of what Doug Hutchinson and Monty Johnson did with the reconstruction of the Protrepticus. So we know approximately when Aristotle composed the Protrepticus, right? And it seems that the ergon argument in the Eudemian Ethics reacts to particular problems entailed in the Protrepticus version and tries to correct them, right? The book has a different conclusion and a slightly different topic than the Protrepticus, but it does react on it, and it seems to correct the ergon argument from the Protrepticus in a certain version. And then the Nicomachean Ethics seems to utilize both arguments, some features from the Protrepticus as well as from the Eudemian Ethics. And in that way, it seems to suggest a certain kind of a chronology of writing of these three texts, and that could be perhaps one of the issue, which is kind of like a sidetrack in that, or side result of the book. But it might be interesting, at least, for example, to destroy my argument in that sense and show that it must be the other way around, or I don't know.
Awesome. All right. Well, I guess we can end here. And so, yeah, the book, to remind everyone, is The Function Argument in Aristotle's Ethics, Happiness and the Human Good by Jakub Jirsa. So, Jacob, thank you so much for joining me.
Samuel, thank you so much for inviting me.